Hi class, Dr. Jim here. In this lecture we're going to be looking at the tissues, and so we're now moving on to our last section of the biology class, and that is now looking at the tissues, the organs, and the structures that make up the human body. And so we're kind of moving into our A&P section for the last few weeks. The first thing we got to do is look at the tissues and what tissues are involved in making up the organs and the organ systems and the different things that we're going to be looking at in the next couple of weeks. So in order to understand all those organs, we have to know what makes those up, and that's what we're going to be looking at this week, and that's the tissues. Now I know some of you out there have an issue with using the microscope still, and I don't want you to be afraid of this or having this issue, because we're here to help. But if you're one of those people, don't be afraid to use them this week, because we really want you to practice and get really good using this to do the tissues. Part of the test coming up is going to be looking at the individual tissue slides, and so we want you to make sure that you have a really good understanding of what you're looking at and how to do those things. Also this week we also have practice slides for you guys to actually practice and look at those tissues and make sure that you get really comfortable with it, so that when you see them on the test you don't go, oh my god, what is that? So it's a way to help with that anxiety, so that you feel comfortable, you know exactly what you're looking at, and you do well on the test. We're here to help you out and make sure that you do well on the test, and that's why we're having you do it. Okay, so make sure you really look at the slides this week. Take your time looking at those things. Use the practice slides that we have, the test slides that we have, so that you get really good, really comfortable, and that you're ready for the test coming up this week. The nice thing about this lecture is that the slides that we have in class are a lot of the same pictures you're going to see on the lecture, and so you can go back and forth and you can use this lecture to really look at the pictures as well. And so that's another reason why to really watch this lecture and practice the slides, because you're going to see really the same types of things with the slides and in the lecture pictures. Okay, so let's start the tissues. So what are we going to do today? Well, first we're going to look at what are tissues and what are the 4 types of tissues that we find in humans. Okay, and obviously in my objectives I'm going to give away the 4 types, but we're going to see each one of the 4 types. Specifically, we're going to define what epithelial tissue is and figure out what that tissue does and where you see it, and how many are there out there. There's quite a few, and how do we define these things? We'll typically define them by the shape and how many layers you see of those things, and so that's what we're going to see there. The next thing we're going to ask is, what is connective tissue and what are the various types? So we're going to talk about the various types. There's fibrous, there's structural, and then there's liquid. And so we're going to look at those different types of connective tissue. And then we're going to look at the 3 types of muscle. And again, one type you actually control, which is skeletal muscle. The other 2 are involuntary, meaning you don't think about, and that is the smooth muscle and the cardiac muscle that you have. And then finally, we're going to look at the various parts of the nervous tissue. And really the only cell that we want you to know of the nervous tissue is the neuron, but we'd like you to know the parts of the neuron. So make sure that you look over these things and really get a good grasp of what makes up the neuron and the nerve cells. Okay, so that's what we're going to be looking at in this lecture today. And again, looking at the pictures and really studying the pictures are really going to help identify these things on the microscope. Okay, so not only the function, but also being able to identify these things. So again, the tissues are a collection of specialized cells organized to perform a function. Now, not all the cells are going to be the same, but most of them are going to be similar looking cells that work together and they perform the similar function together, and that's what we call a tissue. When you have lots of tissues coming together, we then call that an organ, and then the organ then becomes organ systems as they work together with other organs. And so that's kind of how we define that hierarchy. The 4 types of tissues are the epithelial tissue, which you see over here, the connective tissue, which connects things together, the muscular tissue, which helps us move and also moves things through, and then the nervous tissue, which is responsible for sending signals. And we're going to see all these different things, and we're going to take an in-depth or in-close look at all these different types of tissues. All right, so the first thing is the type of tissue, and this is the epithelial tissue, and this is the tissue that we find that forms a continuous layer over body surfaces. So again, our skin, our epithelial or epithelium layer on the outside is part of this. All the tissue that lines our opening, so like our mouth, our nose, our digestive cavity, all has epithelial tissue associated, and so we're going to talk more about what this epithelial tissue does and what it looks like. Okay, also lines body cavities. It also forms the glands. So in the integumentary system, which is this week what we're going to be looking at, we're also going to be talking about the skin and the glands, sebaceous glands, and one of those, obviously, the sebaceous or oil glands is epithelial tissue. We also have epithelial cells that are connected by one another through either tight junctions, adhesion junctions, or gap junctions. And these are all the proteins that we talked about in chapter 5. So remember we talked about proteins that are found in the cell membrane. Well, these are all those things that help cells communicate and keep them together and form tissues. Okay. What does the epithelium do? Well, the biggest thing is protection. So when we talk about our skin or the things around that openings, those are protecting our vital organs. We talk about secretion, again, with oil and sweat. Absorption, absorbing things through, like minerals and nutrients, especially in our intestines. Excretion, especially when we see in our kidneys and our kidney cells, what they do is they excrete stuff out. So they remove the important stuff that's needed and excrete out anything that's not needed. And then finally filtration, which we also see in the lungs and then also in our kidneys as well. So we're going to see a lot of these functions over and over again in the different types of tissues we talk about. Here are the different types of epithelial cells, and I'm going to talk more about these and I'll show you better pictures. But again, the way we define epithelial either is by their shape or how many layers they have, and that's what I'm going to bring up next. So how do we define it? Either by the shape. So what do they look like? And so the first type is the squamous epithelium, and these are flat cells. And so if you remember from the first day of class when we did our cheek cells and you saw those fried eggs, well, all those are squamous cells. Squamous cells are flat cells found on the different areas. So we have squamous cells on our skin, in our cheeks, in our, in our nose, and all these different areas. And those are all squamous or flat cells that we have. The other types of cells we have are cuboidal. These look like little cubes or ice cubes. So think of ice cubes in that case, and those are the cuboidal cells. And then the columnar cells are much larger. They're much longer in shape. And so they don't look like the little cubes, but they look like large rectangles, and that are the cuboidal cells. How many layers is the other way to be defined it. They're either called simple if they're found in one layer, or they're called stratified if they're found in more than one layer. And so most of the time you're going to see them as simple, one layer of cells surrounding something. But on the areas of the skin, the mouth, and the nose, you're going to see stratified layers where you're going to have multiple layers. And because we slough those cells off constantly, and the sloughing allows us to put more cells out front. And so when we have those multiple layers, we call that stratified. Okay? And so here's some pictures just to show you where we find them. And again, you see these pictures in your lab book and also in your textbook, so you can kind of refer to these as well. And you can look at these things in your lab book or in your textbook. And so these are the simple squamous. The squamous are flat cells. These are your cheek cells. We typically see these in the lining of the lung and blood vessels because you don't want them to be very thick. You want to have one layer so that they're used for diffusion. So things get in and out of these cells really easily because they're really thin and easy to diffuse through. Okay. The second type is the simple cuboidal. And again, these look like cube cells. So you see they look like little ice cubes here. And again, they're one layer, so they're simple. And so we find these typically in the kidney, in the tubules, and various glands. That's typically where we see them. And again, one cell thick, and these form little cubes all the way around. And again, we see these in areas where we only want one cell. The next type are the simple columnar cells, and these are a little bit longer, elongated cubes, okay? So they're columns, they look like columns, and these line the small intestine, the oviducts, and then what they're good at is absorbing nutrients, and so they're really good, again, simple layer, one layer, and that. The next type is kind of like the 3A, or what I would call the third type. So the third type are the columnar, but these are kind of the A, which are the pseudostratified, and these have the cilia on top of them, and they look like they're multiple layers, but they're really actually only one layer of cells. And so again, they're columnar layer of cells, and then they have these cilia on the top. And where do we associate cilia in our bodies? Well, in the trachea, and so that's where we see these cells. Okay, and then the last type of epithelial is the stratified squamous. And again, we see this in our esophagus, in our mouth, in our nose, and then in our skin. And again, multiple layers because we slough the skin off all the time. We slough these cells off, and so we want to have multiple layers so that we're completely protected when we do lose these layers of skin. Okay, and so we see these a lot in different areas. Okay, so stratified, multiple layers. Now, another type of epithelial is the glandular epithelium. And we're going to talk about the integumentary system this week as well, along with your skin. And again, the glandular epithelial is part of what gets released out. And so these things release out oils and different chemicals. And so you have different types of glands associated with what they do or where they function. So a gland is basically any cell that secretes, okay? And so it can be one cell or multiple cells. And we have two types. We have the exocrine, which secrete out through ducts or channels, okay? And so when we talk about the sebaceous or oil glands, those are going to be exocrine because they secrete out of their own pores. Okay, endocrine secrete into the bloodstream. So think of into the bloodstream or into a system. That's going to be your endocrine. And so most of the glands that we talk about when we get into the glandular topics, like the pituitary gland or the thymus gland, things like that, they secrete directly into the bloodstream. And so those are all going to be the endocrine or the endocrine system. And we're going to talk more about this later on in the next couple weeks when we get into the different systems. But I kind of want you to remember exocrine versus endocrine. Endocrine into the system, exocrine out of the body. Okay, so kind of think of that. So the next type of tissue we're going to look at is the connective tissue. And there's a lot of different functions with the connective tissue. One is the structural framework of your body. That's all connective tissue. Also responsible for transporting fluids and dissolved materials in the blood, protecting delicate organs is another one, supporting surrounding and interconnecting of tissues, so connecting everything together. That's what connective tissue does. Storing energy reserves, what we have with our fat cells and that, the adipose tissue. And then finally, our white blood cells, which is part of this system, the connective system, is defending us against microorganisms. And we're going to talk more about the white blood cells here. We get into the immune system in a couple weeks. But again, that's something else to kind of think about, and that is also connective tissue. And you can see here an example of all the different types of connective tissue that we have out there. And again, we have fat cells, we have the fibrous connective tissue, which is the ligaments and tendons. We have the loose connective tissue, which is kind of this loose fibers that connect the tissues together, and that we talk about bone, we talk about the cartilage, and then we talk about the blood as well. And so all these different things inside our bodies are different types of connective tissues, and they have a wide range of functions to them. Now, the connective tissue has a lot of specialized cells, and we'll look at some of these specialized cells. But there's also ground substances that are basically non-cellular material. And a lot of that is proteins and things like this. And so we talk about the different proteins fiber, including collagen fibers, reticular fibers, or even elastin fibers. And these are different fibers that we have throughout our body that help connect things together. And again, I'm not going to ask you to know specifically what all these different fibers are. I just want you to know that there are some fibers out there, and these tissues do connect them together. Okay? We do have three categories of connective tissue. That includes the fibrous connective tissue, which is, you think of fibers, the supportive, which is the cartilage and bone, and then the fluid, which is our blood. And so we'll look at all three of these things coming up. So the fibrous tissue, there's really three types. You have the loose fibrous, which is kind of a mismatch of tissue just kind of thrown together. And what you're going to see on the slide is kind of something like this, where you have these different fibers. So you have the elastic fiber, you have collagen, you might have fibroblasts, you might see some adipose tissue. And where do we see this? In the subcutaneous layer of the skin and other places like that. And it helps bind organs together and make sure that they're not all moving around when you're moving and things like that. The next type of tissue we have is the adipose. And adipose is probably one of the easiest ones to identify because what you see are these big air spaces. There's not much that you see with adipose tissue because most of the cell is fat, and fat doesn't stain very well because fat is negatively charged, okay? And so it doesn't stain, so you don't see the fat that's in these cells, so it looks very clear. What you do see is the poor nucleus gets pushed to the side because there's so much fat in these cells. What do these do? Well, they function in storing energy for later usage, and then also insulating our bodies and also protecting us from when we bounce around and things like that. So the fat does a good thing in also not only insulating but protecting our organs on the inside as well. The last type is the dense fibrous tissue, and this is also the collagen and the ligaments and tendons that, again, attach muscle to bone and bone to bone. And so we're going to look at the two different types that we have and make sure that you identify those two. So how do you know the difference between a tendon and a ligament? Well, here you go. If you've always had this question and you still have problems with it, always think tendons connect muscle to bone. Think of tender meat. Muscle is meat. Tender meat is a tendon, so muscle to bone. Okay, so that's how I remember the tendon is a muscle to bone. Ligaments connect bone to bone. And so think about this. An athlete will tear his ligaments, and that's really the two appendages that attach the bone to bone. The typical one that they tear is in their knee. And so what they do is those ligaments attach our femur to our tibia and our fibula. And again, those are the bones that we have in our legs. And if we tear those, then our bones are kind of free floating around. And so think of tendons, tender meat. The tendons connect muscle to bone, and then our ligaments attach our bones to bone. So wherever we have bones attaching to each other in our joints, all those are surrounded by ligaments. Okay? All right, and then this is just kind of a diagram of showing the loose fibrous tissue, and you can see lots of different cells associated. And again, it's kind of a loosely based structure, so there's not a lot of structure to it, whereas in the dense or in the adipose, you're going to see very tightly packed tissue together. And so when you see the loose, think of loose tissue. Okay. Now the two structural types of connective tissue include the cartilage, and again, cartilage has a lot of matrix, and then you see the cells, which are called chondrocytes, inside this matrix. And so these chondrocytes secrete this matrix, and then they kind of surround these cells. The bone is really interesting because I think people really can identify the bone really easily because they look for these circles. When you see these concentric circles, you think of bone automatically. And so this is a bone cell, so the bone cell is in the center, and then you can see the different bone cells around it, and they form these concentric circles or concentric rings around the bone itself. And so it kind of builds off of one another, off another. And so when you see the concentric circles, think of bones, okay? And so that's the structural type of connective tissue. The last type of connective tissue is the fluid connective tissue, and basically that is the liquid matrix or the plasma. And so our blood cells float in that liquid plasma that we have around, and that includes the red blood cells, which transports oxygen, the white blood cells, which are used for immune systems, and then the platelets, which help clot our blood. And so with all these different things we have floating around, it's not just a liquid portion, but we have cells in there as well, the red, the white, and the platelets, okay, and they all have a specific function. Their functions are to transport nutrient and oxygen to the cells and then remove the carbon dioxide and other waste from the cells as well. We also have this extracellular fluid called lymph, and lymph is outside the blood system, so anytime our blood vessels get leaky, they leak this fluid, and that's the extracellular fluid. That fluid then returns to the blood through the lymph system, and we're going to talk more about the lymph system and the lymph nodes when we talk about the immune system in a couple weeks, but I just want you to get aware of these different terminologies, and lymph is the liquid outside our blood system, okay? And again, you can see the different fluid connective, and so most of our blood is plasma, which is a liquid. Then we have the white blood cells, and then the red portion is the red blood cells. And you can see here the different white blood cells. Or again, we're going to look at the white blood cells when we get into the immune system in a couple weeks. And here's the red blood cells, and here the platelets, and then the plasma is the liquid portion. So again, you're going to see some blood cells on a slide, and most of what you're going to see are the little red dots or little red donuts, and that's the red blood cells. And then sometimes you see some of these purple cells, which are the white blood cells. And so if you can see those different things, you're going to be really good for the test, okay? And so that's the fluid connective blood tissues. All right, so the next type of tissue we're going to talk about is the muscular, and the muscular is divided into three different types, okay? Muscular is contractile tissue because it contracts using the actin and myosin filaments. The cells are called muscle fibers, and there are three types. You have the skeletal muscle, which is the voluntary. Voluntary meaning we have to think about it to move. In order for me to move my hands, I have to think about moving my arms and my hands. Okay? We see these muscles under the microscope, we see striations. And so what I want you to think about is striations is skeletal. Striations, skeletal muscle, okay? And so that's what you're going to see here, these different striations in the muscle, think skeletal. Smooth muscle is very smooth. You don't see any striations there. It's involuntary. We don't have to think about our smooth muscle. Where do you see smooth muscle? Smooth muscle is found in our vessels and in our digestive system, and those are used to squeeze things through. So like when we squeeze our blood to get to different parts, that is smooth muscle, along with the smooth muscle that we find in our digestive system that helps squeeze things through. Okay, and that's our smooth muscle. And again, we don't think about those things. The last type of muscle is the cardiac muscle, and the cardiac muscle, again, is involuntary. We don't have to think about it, and there's cells that help it beat. And again, that's all part of the involuntary nervous system where we don't even think about it. If we had to think about our heart beating, we'd be overloaded with trying to think, okay, we got to beat our heart, we got to digest and all these things. Luckily for us, our brain stems do that without us even having to think about it. They send the signal and they allow our hearts to beat without even thinking about those things. Now with the cardiac muscle, they do have some striations, but the biggest difference in those between that and the skeletal muscle is that they have these intercalculated discs. So think intercalculated disc and you think cardiac, intercalculated cardiac, intercalculated cardiac, and that will help you remember the difference between those. Okay? So again, looking at pictures from your book, you're going to see these striations, these really clear striations. When you see striations, think skeletal. When you see no striations, very smooth, think of smooth muscle. And then these intercalculated discs, you're going to see these very dark lines in the cardiac muscle. You see those intercalculated discs, that's going to be cardiac muscle, intercalculated cardiac. And that's a really good way to remember those things. Skeletal, striations, smooth muscle, and then finally cardiac muscle, intercalculated disc. You think of those things and that's what you're going to be thinking about. Okay, the last type of tissue is the nervous tissue, and nervous tissue all deals with the nervous system. And we're going to talk more about the nervous system in the next couple weeks, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this. But the real important cell that we want you to know is the neuron, okay, and the different parts. Now, the nervous system basically takes in the sensory from the outside world. We sense things. We bring that message into our spinal cord. Our spinal cord then sends a message up to our brain. We do the data integration where we think about what's going on in the outside world, and then our brain sends a signal out, and that is the motor part, moving motor, okay? And so that's the motor part. And that's really what the nervous system is. It's sensing, interpreting that sense, and then sending out a response to that sense. Okay, and so that's what we're doing with our nervous system. Now, like I said, the cell that's involved with this is the neuron, and again, it conducts electrical impulses. Your nervous system is an electrical wire inside your body, and so it sends these electrical impulses in and out of your body, and the cell responsible for that is your neuron, and the neuron has some different parts. It has the dendrites, which look like these little branches coming off the cell body, and I'll show you a picture here in just a minute. They're kind of like the little roots. They bring in the signal from the outside world. Those dendrites get the signal. They pass it on to the cell body, which is the main part of the nerve cell. That's where the nucleus is located. It's kind of the big bulb part of that. And then you have the axon, which is kind of the long tail. And you can always tell the axon from the dendrites because the axon is much larger, much longer, and much thicker than the dendrites will be. The other thing we see on the axon is a myelin sheath. And a lot of you have probably seen your electrical wire at home, or maybe you've seen electrical wire, maybe you've gone to Home Depot or something. And you know it has that insulation on the outside. The reason for that is it allows you to keep the electrical current flowing through the wire and not coming out of the wire. Okay. Same thing with the myelin sheath. The myelin sheath keeps that electrical impulse inside the axon, so you don't lose that electrical impulse. And that's why we have that myelin sheath around it. Okay, and so that's an important part of the neuron. Okay, so if we look at the neuron, again, you have these dendrites that look like little roots, and they bring in the little signals that come into the cell body. The cell body then has the nucleus, you can see the nucleus in here, and then sends the message down the axon. And the axon is a much longer piece, so it looks like a long tail on the cell, and then it branches out to the next either dendrites or spinal cord or wherever it's going to be. But again, then the other thing you see on this is the myelin sheath. The myelin sheath provides the insulation so you don't lose that electrical impulse down there. If you do lose that myelin sheath, you have something where you don't get the message and you get what is this paralysis. This is the basis of multiple sclerosis, which is basically where you lose the myelin sheath. Those people lose their myelin sheath and they no longer can transmit the message. The message doesn't get through and they lose their ability to use their motor neurons anymore, and they lose their ability to move. And that's what happens during MS. You see these people get paralysis and other things. And so that's what the myelin sheath is for, to keep the message staying in the axon. Okay? So that's the parts of the neurons that we want. And again, the neuron cell itself, when you look at it in a slide, really easy to see. You're going to see these neurons again and again, and it should be along with the skeletal bone and some of the other ones. Adipose tissue, I think, is a really easy one to identify in the microscope. So make sure you look at these different slides and that you're able to identify what a neuron looks like. Okay, so to summarize, what are the 4 types of tissue? Well, the 4 types are epithelial, connective, muscular, and the nervous. Okay, and so we have those 4 types of tissue in our bodies. How do we define the epithelial? The first type, well, we define it by the shape and number of layers. So how many layers you have and what does it look like? Is it flat? Is it cube? Or is it a column? Okay, and then how many layers you have? Is it simple, 1 layer, or is it stratified, multiple layers? Okay, then you have the functions and types of the connective tissue. You have the 3 types, the fibrous, which includes the loose, the dense, and then the adipose tissue. You have the structural, which is your bone and cartilage, and then finally your liquid, which is the blood. And then you have the 3 types of muscular tissue. You have the skeletal, remember, striated skeletal, smooth is smooth, and cardiac has the intercalculated disc, all right? And then finally the last one is parts of the nerve cell. We have the different parts of the nerve cell. You have the dendrite, the cell body, the axon, and the myelin sheath. And make sure you understand those parts. The dendrite is the small little nerves, or the little pieces that come off the cell body. The cell body has a nucleus. It's the large bulb part. The axon is a long tail. And then the myelin sheath is the insulation around the axon to make sure the message stays in the axon. Okay, so we've come to the end of the video. If you have any questions for me or Jill, please feel free to email me or Jill. And again, or ask in the lab time. We're happy to help. Make sure you look at the slides this week. Very important. Make sure you practice with the practice slides so that you get really good and comfortable for the test. And if there's any other things that you need, please feel free to ask. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.